Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I am pleased to welcome you to this briefing on the response to Hurricane Oscar in Cuba and the United Nations Plan of Action in response to the hurricane. Allow me to start by introducing myself. My name is Victoria Saiz Omeñaca. I am Deputy Director with the Operations and Advocacy Division of OCHA, covering Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean, Asia, and the Pacific. And I'm pleased to chair this briefing today. I'm also pleased to introduce you here in the podium with me, Mr. Francisco Pichon, the United Nations Resident Coordinator for Cuba. And I'm also honored to note that we have today His Excellency, Mr. Ernesto Soberón Guzmán, Permanent Representative of Cuba to the United Nations. Before I open the discussion, let me share a few reflections on Hurricane Oscar in Cuba. The hurricane hit the island on the 20th of October, and it has affected 480,000 people with 8 casualties in the province of Guantanamo. Preliminary reports indicate that at least 14,300 houses or buildings have been damaged or destroyed, with more than 50% of them suffering total roof collapses. Additionally, more than 50,000 hectares of agricultural land have been affected. As it always is the case in natural disaster events, it's always people affected that are the first responders and those that help each other. And in this case, again, the solidarity of people in the affected communities has been evident. Neighbors have shared stories of helping each other to climb to rooftops and evacuate their homes as the water rose rapidly. My colleagues, for example, heard of Adonis Lobaina, a resident of one of the impacted areas, who woke up to the smell of the river water, and by the time he woke up, the water was already at his knees. He helped his wife and 98-year-old mother get out on top of the roof of the house. The United Nations and partners responded immediately in support of the efforts of the government to assist the people affected. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has deployed staff, have released $100,000 of emergency cash grant for immediate supplies, and allocated $3.5 million of the emergency response fund for urgent assistance. The United Nations Plan of Action launched on Friday $33.2 million in funding to assist 478,000 affected people in the province of Guantanamo. We will hear more about these efforts from a resident coordinator in Cuba. Before I pass on the floor, let me share with you a few quick housekeeping reminders. This event is broadcasted in UN Web TV. We invite all of you to use interpretation services, which are available in Spanish and English. And as we have 1 hour for this meeting, I kindly request that you please keep your interventions to 2 minutes. Finally, let me remind you to please keep your mics off if you're not taking the floor. We have a 1-minute video before I hand over to our resident coordinator in Cuba, Francisco. So let me invite all of you to watch the video. Thank you. In the solidarity of people in the affected communities, has deployed staff. Let me remind you to please keep your mics off if you're not. Or I pass on the floor, let me share with you a few quick housekeeping reminders. This event, we have a 1-minute video before I hand over to our resident coordinator in Cuba, Francisco. So let me invite all of you to watch the video. Thank you.
Fue terrible, eso fue cuestiones en el río, se metió así, no dio tiempo a salir, no, y ya, y todas las casas se...
Él perdió la casa también total.
Uno subió con los niños, uno de 3 y uno de 6 años cargados, desde las 1 de la mañana hasta las 2 de la mañana, que lograron sacarnos también. Y ahí pensamos que nos íbamos a jugar.
Logramos sobrevivir, y lo que fue una escena espantosa. Lo que más lamentamos aquí fue la pérdida material, sino la pérdida humana. No sé, nadie esperaba esto.
Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me pass the floor to Mr. Francisco Pichon, United Nations Resident Coordinator for Cuba. Thank you, Mr. Pichon, you have the floor.
Thank you, Victoria, and good morning to all distinguished representatives of the permanent missions and colleagues. And in my very brief introduction, I would like to maybe provide an overview of the general humanitarian situation, some quick summary of the impacts, also the very complex country context for this emergency, what has been the response by the national authorities and the Cuban civil defense, and then what is the role of the United Nations in accompanying the country in this response. First, let me say that, as Victoria has said, the Hurricane Oscar made landfall on October 20 near a town in the eastern part of the country called Baracoa. This area of Cuba is an area that is very vulnerable to climate change, and it also is one of the areas that have lower human development indicators compared to other parts of the country. But I think what is unique is that the hurricane made landfall in the midst of an unprecedented energy crisis. And you might recall that the entire electrical system shut down on October 18, 2 days before the hurricane in Cuba. And this led an island-wide blackout that persisted even for 4 days. And this obviously had an important impact in interfering with the early warning systems that are usually deployed by the Cuban civil defense quite effectively. But the blackout affected, obviously, this deployment of the early warning system. But also it contributed to a very vulnerable context where you had limited basic services, also widespread food spoilage due to the lack of energy, and also some sanitation issues, which have also hampered the rescue efforts. I would say this has intensified the plight of the residents as they awaited the storm. But also this was a very slow-moving hurricane that at times moved to with a speed of 4 kilometers per hour. So it lasted 25 hours in the eastern part of the country, leaving behind a path of destruction for the families and the communities in the area. The destruction that we saw is really a combination of the very strong wind gusts exceeding 130 kilometers per hour, and intense rains that at times accumulated 600 millimeters, really affecting, as Victoria said, nearly 500,000 people, and with almost 150,000 people affected in their most critical needs. In terms of some of the damages, I think Victoria has already mentioned some. 150,000 people have lost their essential belongings, including food, household goods, and personal items. Some preliminary estimates indicate that over 14,000 homes, with more than half experiencing roof collapses, resulting in total losses for many. These are all preliminary numbers because the assessments are still ongoing in the most remote and isolated areas. But also there were damage to health facilities, about 56 healthcare facilities, including hospital, pharmacies, and clinics, have disrupted the critical services such as maternal and child health care, and also increasing the risk of waterborne, vector-borne diseases such as dengue and the fever of Oropuche, which this part of Cuba, the province, Guantanamo province, is a very risk area. Also, 300 of the 347 educational centers in the worst affected area, 150 or 43% of them sustained damage, with also significant losses on the school furniture and all educational materials. And of course, damage to the local infrastructure in terms of the power grid and also water system, also compromising access to water and sanitation. And also the impact is significant on the household living strategies. For example, about 15,000 hectares of crops, mainly coffee, cocoa, were impacted, and this is a very significant source of income for farmers in the area. Also, the infrastructure related to the salt production facilities also were affected, really worsening the employment and economic challenges for the affected families. I had the chance to visit the 4 most affected municipalities together with the representative of UNICEF and the World Food Program, and with the civil defense and the authorities. Last week, we spent time in the 2 municipalities that were worst affected, Imias and San Antonio del Sur, mostly due to floods. And there we found that tens of thousands of people have been left isolated, with risk really for the most vulnerable groups, the elderly, children, pregnant women, and people with disabilities. Some of the images that we heard in the moment that the hurricane hit are really horrific. You know, people swimming out of their houses, going under the waters to be able to swim to safety, to roofs, people saving each other, elderly people being rescued. And in these communities, actually 3 out of the confirmed fatalities took place. So really a very difficult, terrifying situation the night that the hurricane struck. Let me also say a little bit something which is of importance, and is the really complex country context for this emergency. As you know, this hurricane is really hitting at a moment in which Cuba is facing very important economic challenges, perhaps the most difficult challenges in the last 3 decades. I think public institutions are severely constrained in addressing the humanitarian needs of the most affected communities, and are also facing critical shortages of essential supplies, which have impacts on the most vulnerable population. But despite these limitations, I do want to highlight the fact that the civil defense system and the authorities work before the impact to avoid human and material losses. And it has been recorded, as I said, 8 confirmed fatalities, and 2 people are still missing. I think the national response has also been immediate in the most affected territories. We actually saw this, about 130,000 people were evacuated mostly to homes and family and friends. And currently the authorities are focusing on restoring the most vital services and also repairing the damaged infrastructure, which facilitates the response. I like to say that the contributions that the UN can make is relatively modest compared to the mobilization that the country has undergone to support the most vulnerable. The UN support is not a substitute for this significant mobilization that the country is now engaged. And I would say the concern is obviously over the financial limitations which are hampering the recovery effort, given Cuba's lack of access or exclusion for the international financial system, and also the restrictions on trade, which really makes urgent the need for external support to restore the habitable conditions for the vulnerable communities. So this is the action plan that has been prepared last week with the support of OCHA. It's an inter-agency, the whole UN country team has contributed to prioritize these sectors. The plan seeks to mobilize $33 million for immediate response and early recovery for about 500,000 affected individuals and persons in Guantanamo. The sectors that are prioritized are temporary shelter, housing, and early recovery, water and sanitation and hygiene, logistics, education, health, and food security and nutrition. Again, 150,000 people with the most critical needs. The time frame is 18 months, also allowing time for the early, to support the early recovery efforts, as well as the reactivation of the livelihoods of the most affected population. Next slide. Finally, this is my last slide. The UN system has been able to mobilize already 21% of this action plan, or the resources of this action plan. The agencies that are active in Cuba have all activated their humanitarian mechanisms, including the OCHA cash grant, and also the agencies are involved in reprogramming, repurposing their existing operations to support the most critical needs. Already 3.6 million have been mobilized in pre-positioned food and non-food items. These have been mobilized by the agencies locally and also from Panama, and are already en route to the most affected areas. And the CERF, the Central Emergency Relief Fund, has approved already 3.5 million to support the most critical and urgent needs. And I think most of the CERF allocation would be used to replenish the pre-positioned items that have just been released to support the most critical needs. And finally, there is, I like to say that as we speak, tomorrow we expect the impact of a new hurricane, Rafael, who is likely to impact the western part of the country and the central part of the country, even affecting the Havana, which means that we have to manage our own pre-positioning very well. There is still 3 weeks before the end of the hurricane season in Cuba, and makes pre-positioning quite critical for us at this particular moment. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Pichon, for your very interesting presentation on the impact of Oscar and the response from the United Nations and partners. Señoras y señores,
Ladies and gentlemen, I will now give the floor to His Excellency Ernesto Zuron Guzman, Permanent Representative of Cuba at the United Nations, to make an opening speech. Ambassador, you have the floor. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. First of all, I'd like to thank you personally and your team and OCHA as a whole for your sensitivity and for following everything that's going on in Cuba, including before the impact of Oscar. We're very grateful to the coordinator, the acting coordinator, Joyce Suya, for the rapid response for over $5 million from the Emergency Response Fund to respond to the emergency needs. The organization of this briefing, the provision of funds to Cuba, and the mobilization, international mobilization is particularly important symbolically when we know how overstretched OCHA is in dealing with various crises around the world. And also the Cuban authorities are grateful for the help being received from Mr. Pichon, the resident coordinator, and from the UN presence in the country. Friends and colleagues, as you know, based on the plan of action prepared by the UN system in Cuba, the situation in the eastern provinces of our country continues to be very difficult, as Francisco mentioned. Almost 500,000 people suffer the impact of this hurricane, of which 150,000 were severely impacted by this meteorological event. And soon, and as was mentioned, another hurricane will hit our territory. The damage particularly felt in the most crucial areas of life, housing, sanitation, hygiene, healthcare, education, food supplies. So in the Guantanamo province, thousands of Cubans have been affected. Cuba is experiencing the accumulated effects of the blockade over the past 6 decades, which has led to disruptions in the electric network and the supplies of fuel around the country. What we're experiencing are extraordinary, extreme circumstances. To recover from this natural disaster, we need to focus in particular on restoring and energy and fuel supplies. These are essential for the provision of basic services and economic recovery of this province. In spite of the huge challenge that we have, we are not losing hope, because we know we're not alone. The UN system has been with us from the beginning. That has been also many countries have shown solidarity. They have offered help, especially after Hurricane Oscar. Friends, your support and help will be essential for the Cuban people. Unlike majority of countries, Cuba is excluded from the main financial institutions and has very limited access to international capital markets, as acknowledged by the UN response plan itself. I mention these elements to put into context how important it is UN's appeal for $33 million be collected in order to implement the response plan. This will be a huge effort, require a huge effort for the Cuban government to overcome the consequences of the Oscar. Just if you look at the annex of the plan of action, you could see the numerous areas of action that will be covered by the specific projects of the UN system at the country level. We're very grateful for thinking and assisting Cuba, and for everything you're doing to help us. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Mr. Soberon.
the efforts of Cuba in responding to this storm and preparing for many others, and we appreciate the collaboration with the United Nations. We will now turn to your excellencies and distinguished guests for interventions from the floor. In my list, I have the distinguished delegate from Qatar. You have the floor, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, dear colleagues, I would like to, of course, extend our thanks and gratitude to the Office of Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, for organizing this briefing to highlight the important recovery efforts following Hurricane Oscar, which impacted Cuba last month. And I also would like to thank my colleague, of course, Ambassador Ernesto Guzman, Permanent Representative of Cuba, for sharing his briefing today with us. And again, I would like to extend our heartfelt condolences and sympathies to you, Ambassador Ernest, and to the government and the people of Cuba, and to the families who have lost loved ones and suffered losses due to Hurricane Oscar. In the province of Guantanamo, the hurricane's impact has left thousands in extremely difficult conditions, as we have heard today in the briefing, with widespread flooding, power outage, and shortages of essential and medical services. The storm severely affected 56 public health facilities and caused damage to 150 schools, which we really see as a devastating information we are hearing so far. We commend, of course, the efforts of OCHA and support its action plan to assist over 400,000 people affected by the hurricane. We join OCHA and the other international organizations in calling for assistance to help to the people of Cuba rebuild and recover the area. The state of Qatar, of course, is engaged bilaterally with Cuba, and we stand ready to provide all the assistance possible to overcome this devastating impact of the hurricane. Qatar, of course, places high priority on assisting communities affected by natural disasters and climate change. And we are, again, exploring the means to do that immediately. I want to reiterate the state of Qatar solidarity with the people, with the government and people of Cuba in these challenging times, and we are confident that the government and people of Cuba will overcome the damage and devastation caused by Hurricane Oscar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your remarks. Next is the distinguished delegate from Vietnam. You have the floor.
Thank you. I'd like to thank OCHA, DRC in Cuba, and the distinguished permanent representative of Cuba for the comprehensive briefings on the response to Hurricane Oscar in Cuba. It is essential for member states to stay informed about the situation on the ground to effectively assist the government and people of Cuba as they face these immense challenges. The consequences of the Hurricane Oscar are devastating. The challenges are compounded by existing economic difficulties and energy shortages, and by Cuba's exclusion from major international financial institutions. We welcome the UN's action plan to address the immediate needs of those affected by the hurricane. This is crucial in mobilizing resources and coordinating efforts to provide rapid assistance. Vietnam stands in solidarity with the people and government of Cuba in their courageous resurgence from this natural disaster and in their struggle against economic difficulties. Through bilateral channels, the government of Vietnam has announced the provision of 10,000 tons of rice and is ready to do more for our Cuban brothers and sisters. Historically, Cuba has demonstrated a strong commitment to humanitarian relief, providing quick response and assistance to countries in need around the world. Now it is the international community's turn to support Cuba as it navigates these difficult times. I thank you.
Thank you, His Excellency Dan Huang. Next is China. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. China wishes to thank OCHA, especially the resident coordinator to Cuba, for the briefing and for organizing this event. We also appreciate the briefing given by the distinguished permanent representative of Cuba, and we would like to convey China's condolences and sympathy to the government and the people of Cuba, and especially for the families of those who lost their loved ones to the Hurricane Oscar. We appreciate the efforts and immediate action taken by UN OCHA in particular, and also the UN country team in Cuba, and commend the Cuban government for its strong leadership and effective mobilization of resources, even if under very complex and difficult situations. But China is also a country that suffers from severe natural disasters, and I understand that under such circumstances, besides the national leadership and ownership, which is so essential and crucial, international solidarity and support is also very, very important. The role played by the UN and the agencies are very critical in the case of Cuba, which has its own complex circumstances. Therefore, we would like to call on the international community to contribute to the plan of action and urge the developed countries to fulfill their responsibilities of addressing climate change and also to contribute to the plan as part of it. China shares a long-standing friendship and cooperation with Cuba over many years and will firmly support Cuba and its people in its response to the disaster and post-disaster reconstruction and the current arrangements and frameworks. We have full confidence that Cuba and its people will unite in solidarity and overcome the current difficulties. Thank you.
Thank you to the distinguished delegate from China for your intervention. And next in the list is the distinguished representative of the European Union. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you also to OCHA for organizing this important briefing. I will raise three specific points, and first of all, would like to echo, of course, as previous colleagues have done, our condolences to the communities and to the families who have been affected by the impact of this hurricane. My first point basically relates to our ongoing support, our humanitarian support in Cuba, where we are supporting basically three specific projects to strengthen the disaster preparedness with community resilience, institutional capacity, and early warning systems. Also this year, we allocated in addition to this support, 500,000 euro to Cuba to address critical health needs for maternal and child health care services in 3 provinces. We have supported the response for Hurricane Ian in 2022, and we will do so also for the response to Hurricane Oscar. Unfortunately, I cannot provide exact details yet because our emergency package is basically being finalized, but it would include a significant allocation of financial support, primarily to provide immediate assistance to the displaced persons and focus also on the dire needs in the health and food sector. And it would be in close alignment, of course, with the UN Plan of Action. In addition to this, we are also in the process of mobilizing humanitarian air bridges from Panama to mobilize basically UN and ECHO stockpiled, so EU stockpiled items that would also support the emergency response. And of course, as soon as we can communicate on this, we will provide details. And then finally, I also would like to highlight that with Cuba, we have a memorandum of understanding under the EU, Latin America, Caribbean MOU on integrated disaster risk management. And within this framework, we have a close cooperation to jointly enhance disaster preparedness and response, which I understand might be very useful also as the hurricane season has not come to an end yet. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to the distinguished delegate of the European Union. And next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Norway, Mr. Magnus Andersen. You have the floor, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you to the distinguished PR and Ambassador for Cuba and the resident coordinator here for bringing us together today. From the side of Norway, I would like to make 3 points. First of all, we are terrified by the devastating impact the Hurricane Oscar has had on Cuba, and we have the strongest sympathy with the Cuban people in the ordeals they are facing following the hurricane. We stand in solidarity with you. We are equally impressed with the resilience and stamina of the Cuban people and society are showing in dealing with such natural disasters under the most difficult circumstances. My second point is this. Norway is the fifth biggest donor to the Central Emergency Relief Fund, which is managed by OCHA, and we are pleased to see that the fund has already contributed a substantial amount to the response in Cuba. And this shows how SURF, as it called in short, is a key mechanism to finance rapid humanitarian response in acute crisis. We're also one of the donors to IFRC's Disaster Response Emergency Fund, which has also contributed to the response. My final point is this. Exactly the response from SURF and from IFRC, the UN country team, and other humanitarian organizations show the importance of supporting an international humanitarian system, and that includes the UN and their agencies and their personnel, which is capable of delivering life-saving humanitarian aid to the many persons in need globally. The situation in Cuba also shows the importance of redoubling our common efforts on disaster risk reduction, including when it comes to early warning, prevention, and building resilience. We thank you for sharing the action plan here today, and we will look at it closely. I thank you.
Thank you to the distinguished delegate of Norway for your intervention. And next, I give the floor to the distinguished delegate of Canada.
Unfortunate that we have to gather for this type of situation. We would like to express our sincere condolences to the people and families and the communities that are facing the consequences of the hurricane. Thank you. Hurricane Oscar, as we've heard, has had very devastating effects on the communities in the Guantanamo area. I appreciate the briefing that was provided here, the solidarity of the communities and the first responders as also being critical in demonstrating the resilience of the people there. For Canada, as a key donor to OCHA's pool fund, we support the $3.5 million allocation in response to the impacts of the hurricane. At the same time, we have also provided $400,000 in immediate assistance to respond to the impacts. This includes an allocation through the Canadian Humanitarian Assistance Fund to support relief operations by Care Canada and to UNICEF. These partners will provide emergency health, water, sanitation, hygiene services, and distribute essential relief supplies to crisis-affected people in Cuba. We appreciate very much the plan of action that was released, and we will be considering providing additional support, and Ottawa is currently looking at that. Again, I'd like to express our appreciation to the humanitarian system, to the UN system, and all the agencies in providing much needed response and care. Thank you.
Thank you to the distinguished delegate of Canada for her intervention. Next in my list is the distinguished delegate of Oman. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Oman would like to express its sincere solidarity with the Republic of Cuba and its friendly people as they face the difficult impact of Hurricane Oscar. This disaster has greatly affected thousands of Cuban families, and we stand with them in these challenging times. We also express our deep appreciation for the efforts made by the United Nations, especially the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, in providing quick support and coordinating the humanitarian response. We recognize that the needs are large and require continued support. We believe strongly in the importance of international cooperation to help those affected by natural disasters. We call on international community to strengthen efforts to support Cuba and its people and to help rebuild and restore stability in the affected communities. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you to the distinguished delegate of Oman for your remarks. And this concludes the list of speakers that I have. Before we finalize, let me see if there is any additional speakers who would like to intervene, sir. Please, thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. We also came to join words of support to our brotherly Cuban colleagues and Cuban people. We basically would like to convey our condolences to the government of Cuba and to brotherly people, and our sympathies also as a country which suffers a lot from different natural disasters. We would like also to commend the work of OCHA and the efforts of the country team and resident coordinator, Ms. Pichon, who is with us today. We would like to welcome these observations from the ground by Mr. Pichon. We're also happy that because we're a contributor to SURF, the Central Emergency Relief Fund, constant major contributor to SURF, we were happy that SURF reacted quickly to this action plan with its contribution. We think this contribution can be more, can be larger. Of course, Russia has a long tradition of cooperating with Cuba in implementing different projects of support, both of humanitarian and development assistance, and we want to keep this particular request also as a priority one when considering our cooperation and assistance to Cuba in our future efforts. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much to the distinguished delegate of the Russian Federation. I think we have one more intervention. Please, sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. On behalf of Ireland, I would just like to thank OCHA for arranging this briefing and to thank the RC for his intervention, and to more widely thank the UN system, including OCHA and of course SURF, for their quick response to the terrible impact of Hurricane Oscar. Ireland, for its part, is providing some assistance in this case through the START Fund and through the International Federation of the Red Cross's Disaster Relief Emergency Fund. And we are also significant contributors through SURF. Thank you.
Thank you, distinguished delegate from Ireland, for your kind comments. I don't see any other requests for interventions, in which case, let me hand over to the resident coordinator of Cuba, Mr. Francisco Pichon, for his final remarks.
Thank you very much for all your comments and your contributions and your support to Cuba in this particular moment. I'd like to say that we have prepared an action plan that I think should be an instrument to serve and assist as a framework for prioritizing support, whether that support comes through bilateral cooperation or through contributions which are made through the UN agencies or the UN system or through NGOs. At the country level, we have launched the action plan on Friday, not only with the members of the diplomatic community, the ambassadors, your head of cooperations, but also with the various NGOs that are active in the country, including the Federation, the International Federation of the Red Cross, which attended the launching of this event. And we have asked that the plan be used as an instrument because it's obviously it has an ambitious resource mobilization target, a part of which we expect to feel through the support that the UN agencies can mobilize. But we hope that some of that gap is also addressed through the efforts that are being done through the NGOs and to the Red Cross, and also trying to visualize the bilateral cooperation in the context of the plan. So we hope the plan can be used as a framework for choosing the sectors and the projects that are being prioritized together with the authorities as the most critical needs. This is, we hope that this could be, that the plan can be used extensively in that sense. And also I would like to say that the whole area of risk management, anticipatory action and response to disaster is one of the pillars of the UN cooperation framework in Cuba. This is a critical area for Cuba, being a small island development state, being also a country under sanctions, which means having restrictions in terms of accessing financing, having trade restrictions. In a moment like this, is so important to be able to quickly receive inputs, equipments to the country, in addition to what is already pre-positioned in the country. So for Cuba, this area is quite key. It's a key development area to really support and have predictable funding to support the country and the people in a context of an emergency like this. So we thank you for all your support, for the bilateral cooperation, and also for the commitments that have been coming from countries like Canada, EU, through the ECHO, the good collaboration and the good engagement that we have with your head of cooperations to use the action plan as this guiding framework as we support and mobilize resources to respond to the emergency. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pichon. And thank you to all the distinguished delegates. Thank you to the permanent representative of Cuba for your participation here today. Thank you for your appreciation of the Central Emergency Response Fund. We take pride in it being the fastest possible instrument to respond to disaster, and your contributions are hugely helpful to make sure that it can continue to function effectively. I want to underline the importance of a speedy response to natural disaster events. We know it's essential. Without immediate and sustained action, lives can be lost, and more lives are impacted in a very negative way. And as we all, I think in all countries and all parts of the world suffer the impact of climate change, the importance of our collaboration and cooperation cannot be understated. So thank you for coming here today in support of Hurricane Oscar response. The United Nations and our partners in Cuba are committed to ensuring an effective, principled, and accountable response. And we're ready to continue to support, but we cannot do it alone. We need your help. So thank you for that. And you have printouts of the response plan around the room in case you want to have a look at it and see more in detail what the response will be focusing on. With this, I conclude this briefing, and thank you very much again.
Bueno, hemos compartido la reunión que hubo en el seno de las Naciones Unidas sobre la situación en Cuba a raíz del huracán Oscar y los apagones. Hemos querido compartirlo, entre otras cosas, porque yo creo que es importante hacer la pregunta que pone Electrón Libre ante nuestros ojos, y yo creo que hay que repetirla, ¿no? Y cómo es posible que haya sectores de la diáspora cubana, del exilio cubano, de la emigración cubana, que expresen un desprecio y una falta de solidaridad con algunos de los golpeados por el huracán Oscar, que tiene una situación que han perdido los techos, que han perdido prácticamente todo, y que ante un reporte como el que presentó el representante, el coordinador de asuntos humanitarios de las Naciones Unidas, todo esto está en inglés porque ni siquiera las Naciones Unidas ha puesto una traducción en español. Yo traté de buscarla Esto ocurrió el 5 de noviembre y lo quisimos transmitir para ustedes. Así que hasta la próxima. La pregunta que se ha planteado es clara. Y yo creo que lo hemos visto a lo largo de toda la transmisión. Hubo quien lo dijo, hubo quien honestamente estaba discutiendo cosas sin mucho sentido. Y entiendo, porque quizás no entendían el inglés en el cual se estaba discutiendo esto. Las Naciones Unidas no tuvieron una traducción al español, así que incluso tuvimos que escuchar, en lugar de la presentación del embajador en español, escuchamos su traducción en el inglés. Pero yo creo que la pregunta importante esta, yo creo que hay que hacérsela, ¿no? ¿Cómo es posible que otras naciones hablen más alto y exijan más que nosotros en apoyo a nuestra propia gente? Yo creo que esto él no lo dice en general de todos los cubanos que viven fuera, porque muchos sí hemos pedido y hemos abogado porque se produzca cambios de política que permitan que la ayuda humanitaria llegue, vaya por una cuestión de mera humanidad, se suspenda inmediatamente toda aplicación de cualquier sanción que pueda afectar la llegada de ayuda humanitaria a Cuba, pero hay algunas personas que está claro que sí caen dentro de esta categoría que Electrón Libre pone allí, que es cómo es posible que otras naciones hablen más alto y exijan más que nosotros. Lo hicieron de la Unión Europea, lo hicieron de Omán, lo han hecho de Qatar, lo han hecho de Bulgaria, lo han hecho de Vietnam, lo han hecho de un grupo grande de países. Así que ahí lo dejamos. Esto, bueno, sí, Mendive, es posible que la adicionen pero en este momento la única versión que había era en inglés. Te agradezco, Mendive, que estés por aquí, pero bueno, hasta la próxima. Vamos a ver si hoy por la tarde hacemos algo o más hacia la noche hacemos un programa sobre cómo vayan saliendo los resultados electorales. Hasta la próxima. Nos vemos. Chao. Chao.